Okay, so welcome back, everybody, for the new episode of the Crosse Thinkers Podcast. And today we have Dr. Bianca Basten from the psychology department, and we will be talking about something I still don't know what it is: source memory and eyewitness memories. So, can you start with what are they? What are source memory and eyewitness memories?
Sure. So think of kind of source memory as, so you and I have a conversation right now, and a week from now, you're trying to remember something that we talked about in the conversation. So that would be your memory of the actual conversation and the items that we covered in the conversation. Now, as part of that, you are technically also encoding the source. So I would be the source of it. So if I tell you something about how memories are formed, and you remember that a week later, you might also then remember, oh, it was Bianca who told me about that. So I would be the source of that information. And you can kind of extend that, and you could say, it came also in the context of this video chat that we had, or it came in the context of the podcast. So you've had, like 30 different conversations with different people in your podcast. And so they're all the different sources of the information, of your memories about what you talked about. So source memory in general is really just the kind of the context and the who, the where, the how of how we remember certain things. Now,
So,
go ahead.
is that almost like the things I associate with the actual memory?
In some ways, yes, and it kind of actually depends on who you ask. So different people who study source memory, some are much more kind of specific about it, and they will say the source is the person from whom you got the information. Other people will say the source can be anything. If I show you a list of words and half the words are printed in blue and half are printed in red, then you later on remembering not just the words, but the color in which they're printed, that could also be a source. And again, it just depends on who you ask and how specific you get in your definition of what's a source and what's more like the context in which you encounter the information.
Got it. What about eyewitness memory?
So eyewitness memory is kind of a more applied form of studying memory. So think of source memory as very kind of nitpicky, specific stuff we test in the lab under very controlled circumstances. And another kind of almost extension of that is to talk about eyewitness memory, because when we talk about eyewitness memory, it's much more applied and much more like related to real life and the types of memories we see in real life. But we still draw on what we know from our very basic controlled experiments on source memory. Because in eyewitness memory, oftentimes what matters isn't just what do you remember, but are you certain that you remember it based on seeing it during the event? Or did you hear about it afterwards? Did someone suggest to you in an interview that this is what happened? Did you read about it afterwards in the paper? So sources, particularly in eyewitness memory, can get really easily confused. So it's really important to kind of take that into account as we study eyewitness memory, to also go back to what we know about source memory and where do these pieces of information actually come from.
So why do we care about these two things, like source memory and what's the applied side of it?
So I care about it because I'm a cognitive psychologist and I find it just fascinating to talk about memory in general. I think in the context of eyewitness memory, obviously we care because the stakes are pretty high. Right? If I'm relying on eyewitness memory and eyewitness testimony to either convict or exonerate a defendant, then I better know a lot about how that works and how reliable it is and whether it's okay to use it, how much stock I can put into it. So I think just the application piece of eyewitness memory and eyewitness testimony is just really interesting and relevant. Still.
So that actually brings us to a concept I found really interesting, that is false memory. So I read several stories about this when I was recommended a book on hidden brain, I think it's called. It's just like sometimes you think you remember so many details about a certain scenario and turns out everything is fake. And people kind of say, for example, I remember there was a case, they were talking about a girl got raped and she was so concentrating on memorizing everything about the person who is doing harm to her, and say, hey, I'm going to memorize every single details I can memorize so I can testify him in court. And the court took it really seriously and then say, hey, there's nothing the memory can go wrong because you are so concentrated. And turns out the case was her memory was not trustworthy. Okay, so can you elaborate on that, like false memory? How does that thing happen?
Yeah, so false memories, and we can talk about this in the context of eyewitness memory or in general. We don't even have to go directly to eyewitness memory. All of us, whether we're aware of it or not, actually carry around a ton of false memories with us. And our brain is pretty certain that we're right in what we remember. We typically trust our memories quite a bit, and we should, because for the most part, they're pretty decent. But more often than not, and the tricky thing is that we're actually not aware of it. We have not necessarily completely 100% false memories, but certainly memories that have been kind of diluted or slightly changed or adjusted based on either how we perceived the event in the first place when we encoded the memory, or how we kind of processed it afterwards. You know, something happens to you and you think, I'm always going to remember this. And then you tell a friend about it, and then you keep thinking about it, and it's really on your mind. And every time you keep thinking, I'm never going to forget this. But with every kind of iteration that your brain goes through, whether internally or by talking about it, you're actually kind of changing the patterns in your neurons, and you're re-encoding it ever so slightly differently. So who knows, 5, 6, 7 times later, that original memory is very different. And that's when we talk about false memories. Again, they don't have to be completely made up. They can have a lot of overlap with what actually happened, but it's incredibly rare that you have 100% accurate memories on anything, let alone highly emotional events or highly traumatic events that you're trying to encode.
That's interesting. So which one is more trustworthy, the original memory or actually the memory you iterated for the more you iterate a memory, the more it becomes less real, the less it becomes reliable?
Yeah, that's kind of what the research suggests. So in general, a lot of the research on eyewitness testimony, eyewitness memory particularly, so we can kind of drill down a little deeper. So eyewitness testimony and eyewitness memory is kind of the catch-all phrase, right? If you're a witness to an event, if you're the victim of an event, a criminal event, if you're identifying a perpetrator. So all of it is kind of eyewitness testimony, eyewitness memory. And then the more specific idea or topic that's often studied is eyewitness identification. So you looking at a lineup and saying, this was the person who did it. That's the ID part. And both in eyewitness testimony and eyewitness identification, the kind of somewhat accepted tenor is always eyewitness testimony is highly unreliable. There's very little correlation between confidence and accuracy, and we shouldn't trust it. And we know for a fact that there are a ton of cases that get overturned based on DNA evidence later on, who were defendants were originally convicted based on eyewitness testimony. So kind of the easy way of summarizing it would be to say, we can't trust it. It's not reliable. And then there's always that caveat of, well, it depends. So more and more research suggests that no, there's actually a decent correlation between your confidence and your accuracy, but only if we look at your confidence kind of at time zero, right when you first talk about it, or right when you first ID the person. If you're really highly confident at that point, that's a pretty decent predictor that you're also reasonably accurate. Not a perfect predictor at all, but it's somewhat of a reasonable predictor. Whereas if I then, sometimes it takes 12 months before a case goes to trial. If I then ask you again when you're on the stand and you say, and do you remember, Mr. Chen, you were the witness, and at the time you identified this person, how confident are you in that identification? And you say, I am 100% confident. That's the person. You point at that person. Now, for the 12 people in the jury, that's highly effective, right? You sitting up there going, I am totally certain. What they should really ask is, how certain were you at the very beginning? When you first were in that room identifying the person, were you just as certain then, or has your certainty kind of increased over the last year because you've kind of forgotten just how uncertain you were? And the more often you talk about it, the more certain you became over time.
So basically your brain is trying to tell a coherent story to make everything certain, and then that's kind of like reinforced on on your memory to make it a complete story so you can accept that thing.
Yeah, your brain is really good at filling in the gaps that you're missing and kind of making you think you're all that. And most of the time that's a good thing, right? Our brains are incredibly good at, like I said, filling in the gaps and kind of helping us along and using shortcuts to make us more efficient. And the vast majority of the time that's a good thing, but then in some of those situations it's not, because then it kind of messes with your ability and kind of makes you feel much more confident than you are in your memories and wanting to be right. Your brain likes to be right.
That's interesting, because from a layman point of view, is like every time you identify somebody, probably a natural question to ask right away is just, are you sure?
Mm-hmm.
And the moment you ask, are you sure, perhaps you're already putting an impact on what the people are trying to memorize.
And then think about that. You're not making that judgment in isolation, right? If you're in that situation where you're identifying a subject, you're probably surrounded by some police officers, you're surrounded by other people. You might even get kind of indirect reinforcement. All it takes is, let's say the police person working with you knows, person number 3 is the one that we're pretty sure did it. And you're actually not 100% sure, but you go, you know what, person number 3 kind of looks like the person that I saw. And all it takes, whether that's intentional or unintentional, is for the police officer to go, good job.
Oh.
And bam, your brain goes, oh, good. Reinforcement. I did it right. Whether that actually implies that you got it right or not doesn't matter in that case.
That's
so
so
just
interesting.
That subtle little thing of, oh, yeah, nicely done. Sends your brain a message that's, oh, good. I was correct.
But then the more you wait, it turns out probably your memory is less reliable. But how do you justify for the case? Some people just say, hey, I recall some details, which I didn't remember the first time I did the testimony. Is that even a thing? Does it even happen? Just some people just after a month suddenly remember something which they forgot.
Yes. So technically that's possible, right? Well, again, we don't always have to relate this to eyewitness memory. We can just talk about eyewitness memory, and eyewitness testimony isn't really different from just regular everyday memories. There's nothing super special about it in a lot of different ways. So think about any kind of event where you forgot something and you're really trying really hard to come up with it. Maybe you're trying to, remember a group of friends you were hanging out with in high school. And you have all of these memories about high school and the people that you were hanging out with and the things you did. And there are clearly some gaps, right? Because we don't remember everything like a recording. So let's say you have another conversation with someone and you go, oh, I remember, and when we did this and we did that, and you go, no, I don't remember that. And then a week later, completely unrelated, there might be some almost subconscious trigger that makes you go, oh, you know what? I do remember this. And now I remember this part, and now I remember that part. So yes, it is totally feasible that you don't remember something initially and then you remember it later. But again, the downside is we have no real way of telling if that's then a real memory that all of a sudden comes to you, or if that's just something that you think you remember because maybe subconsciously you heard it somewhere else or someone suggested it to you or something like that.
Yeah, that's actually going to be my next question, but now you just answered it. It's just like, then if after 2 months they remember something, how do you know it's a high quality thing? Or it's just something they just end up making up because we can no longer just, interesting.
How do we distinguish real memories from these false memories? If we do this, so again, there's a ton of research on this, right? To me, one of the downsides of the research is we know a ton about this, but we know it from these rather controlled, very carefully balanced lab studies in these perfectly set up circumstances where I might show you a video of a crime and you're watching it, total focus on the video, and then I ask you questions about it, and maybe I'll try to mislead you, and then a week later I'll make you come back to the lab and I ask you again. So these are very controlled circumstances. Right? So most of what we know about eyewitness testimony and memory comes from a lot of these controlled lab studies. There aren't as many studies that have somewhat better ecological validity, where we can say, yeah, this kind of simulates the real world environment of being caught off guard, watching something, witnessing something, of being interviewed in this weird environment, and then maybe reading about it on the news and then being re-interviewed. So all of these different factors kind of come into play. So going back to your original question, if we test this in the lab, they've actually come up with ways to kind of get at that exact question of how do we know if it's a real memory or kind of a made up memory. And there's different ways. I can put you in a scanner, an MRI scanner. At the time at which you're encoding information, if I put you in the scanner while you're learning information, and I look at what activity is going on in your brain, and then I later ask you, do you remember this? Or do you just kind of have this vague sense of, oh yeah, that seems familiar? The activity in your brain is different at encoding based on, or I can kind of predict your answer later on. So if later on you tell me, you know what, I remember this 100%, I absolutely have good memory, I have source memory of this, then I can go back to your brain activity while you were in the scanner learning about this, and I see your hippocampus being pretty active. If on the other hand, later on I ask you about something else and you go, you know what, I'm not 100% sure, this kind of seems familiar, I think I've seen this before, maybe that was the person. If that's your answer, I can pretty much guarantee that at the time that you were encoding that piece of information, your hippocampus wasn't that active. Another part of your brain, kind of a little removed from the hippocampus, rhinal cortex or some in that area, was probably more active at that time.
So is it fair to say like you're trying to use the activity of your hippocampus to tell when you encode the memory, if the memory is reliable when it was encoded, but it has to happen at the moment of the encoding?
Exactly. So,
okay.
Meaning in the real world, that's absolutely impossible. Right? In the real world, I'm not going to have you in the scanner as you're witnessing a crime. There are less high-tech ways of doing this that people have kind of played around with, but they're equally iffy and kind of tricky. So the idea is I can ask you to kind of reflect on the actual memory. So if I say, think back to your last birthday or something. What did you do for your last birthday? Did you get together with friends? I can see you're thinking about it. And so if you have a real memory connected to that, right now, as you're thinking about it, you should be thinking about a lot of very vivid kind of auditory, visual kind of things that are popping up in your brain. If for whatever reason you had kind of an implanted memory or a false memory related to that, there's some evidence to suggest, and again, this is by no means highly scientific, but there's some evidence to suggest that then you kind of reflecting on that memory wouldn't be quite as vivid. It would be less about, I can kind of feel, I have a feeling associated with that, and it would be really more like a kind of almost you watching yourself in a movie as you're thinking about the memory. And again, we call those memory characteristics, and someone came up with a memory characteristics questionnaire that you can give people to kind of figure out, is that a real memory or not? Can we use that to really accurately predict whether it is or not? No. It gives us a vague idea that it's a little better than chance.
So this one is more like a first person feeling, and a third person feeling is basically first person is more likely to be real, and third person is more likely to be false. And also the more details you remember, actually the faker.
Well, that one's tricky too. So it kind of depends on how you see the theme here, right? It depends. It always depends.
Because let me just say what I think here, right? For normal people, it will say like, there's no way my memory is fake if I remember the color of your dress and the jewelry you were wearing, and also I remember you fell over. So that's like tons of details. So my memory cannot be fake. But according to what you just said, I kind of feel like this is not reliable either. Actually, the more detail, the more fishy things are going on.
Not always. So the more detail, I don't know. I wouldn't say the more detail, the more fishy. it's kind of the quality of the detail, but it also actually depends on where that false memory is coming from. So again, they've done these cool lab studies where you get participants into the lab and you give them this list of events or activities that probably never happened to them, but some of them may have. So let's say, has it ever happened to you when you were a little kid that you got lost in a mall? And you would read that and you go, no, I don't really remember that. I don't think I ever got lost in the mall. Or have you ever had a ride in a hot air balloon? And you might say, no, I don't think I've ever experienced that. And so then there's different manipulations we can do. So if you say, no, you know what, I've never been lost in the mall when I was a kid, I'll go, okay, that's great. Now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to imagine. Go back to when you were 4 years old, you were at the mall or at a shopping center with your parents and you ran away and you got lost. And imagine what that must have felt like for you at the time as a 4-year-old. Imagine just how sad and how distraught you must have been, and how happy you were when someone finally found you and reunited you with your parents. And I make you go through this, right? So you're imagining this in a lot of detail. Or what's one step worse I can do to you is I can say, really, you've never been in a hot air balloon? I have a picture here of you with your parents in this hot air balloon. And I can tell you a story about it because I talked to your parents about this and they tell me, we have the picture of you with them in the hot air balloon, and it's a Photoshop picture. You don't know that, but I'm showing you this picture. And again, I say, you don't remember this? You were so excited and you were flying over, blah, blah, blah. And again, I implant this memory in you. And as you're sitting there, I can see by your face that you go, that doesn't work, right? You wouldn't be able to implant that memory in me. And it doesn't work for everyone, but in a large number of participants, if I then have them come back a month later and they go through that same list of have these things ever happened to you, there's a good chance you will now check the box that says, yep, when I was a kid, I got lost in the mall. Or, yep, when I was a kid, I was in a hot air balloon. And I can ask you about it. And all of a sudden you will tell me the story, and you will be fairly certain that that is your story, with a lot of detail about how you felt and what that was like. But again, if we really then go back and make you evaluate those characteristics of those memories, you would likely have, like you said, that was actually a really good characterization, that third person perspective, right? Watching yourself in the movie of being in the hot air balloon or being lost in the mall versus that internal experience of, yeah, I remember the visuals, I remember the auditory, I remember the sensations and the feelings associated with that. But so I can make it happen.
When you test it again, will the details the person describe the same as the details you try to implant, or actually they are going to make up their own details?
There will be some overlap, and they might, if they're really getting into it, they might actually add to it.
That's very interesting. So does it only work on childhood memory? Because if you ask me, I don't remember anything before I was 5 years old. So if you claim it happened, if for example, if my parents say you did it, I would say, okay, probably I did it. Mm-hmm. But will it work to adults?
Not as well, but it can still work.
Interesting.
So if I say, think back to your 25th birthday, like I remember that I had a 25th birthday, but I don't remember the exact details of it. So we have the other thing that comes into play here is that your memories are kind of organized in schemas and kind of clumped together. So all of your memories of all of your different birthdays in some ways overlap. So there's a pretty good chance that when you think back to one particular birthday, you might actually automatically activate some memories from another birthday without even realizing it. So if I then suggest something to you, it may not work quite as well as with childhood memories, because for those, you're much more open to believing that you've just forgotten. But if I do it in a clever enough way, and I really make you think about it, we call it confabulation. I make you articulate what it would have been like. There's a pretty good chance, again, not for everyone, not for all memories, but more often than chance, you're going to have some kind of false memory implanted.
Wow.
It's frightening, really. Now, in the real world, that doesn't happen as often, right? In the real world, you're not surrounded by manipulative people trying to implant memories in you.
I don't know. Has anybody tried it to do it in social media or just at a massive scale? Just like, 1 million people receive this message and see how many people got got to think this actually happened?
Not that I'm particularly aware of that particular incident, but again, there are plenty of studies on this of kind of, and sometimes it doesn't even have to be an active implanting. So there's one other pretty well cited study where there was a plane crash. This was prior to 9/11. There was a plane crash somewhere in the Netherlands, and it was all over the news at the time. It was, I think, sometime in the 90s. It was all over the news, but the actual footage of the plane crash, nobody had footage of it. You could see footage of the aftermath, but nobody at the time, this was pre-cell phones, nobody was running around randomly taping planes. So it didn't exist. There was no footage of the actual crash. And about a week after the crash, these researchers did this study where they said, hey, come into the lab, answer some questions about this plane crash. Again, national news, everybody knew about it. And they were asked, what do you remember about the plane crash? When you saw the footage, describe what you remember from the footage. Now, just that, the way that question is framed, right? There's a leading question there. It implies that there is footage and that you should remember something. And what do you know? Lots of people reported the footage and what they saw and what they remember, and they are certain that they saw the footage. When in reality, there was no such thing. They couldn't have possibly seen it. So this wasn't an intentional implantation of a memory. This was just a question. Hey, tell me about the footage. And
so
all you had to say was there was no footage, but you just went along.
So they basically make up memories as they answer the question.
Yeah, we make up the memory oftentimes in response to the way the question was framed. So if I say, tell me about the footage, that implies that there is footage. And then even if you don't have that active memory, that source memory of, oh, I remember seeing the footage on TV, you may not activate that source memory. And what you might be describing is, maybe someone came up with one of those graphics, how they do these accident reconstructions afterwards. And you remember seeing that graphic, that cartoon-like illustration of what that plane crash might have looked like, or you remember seeing the aftermath in the pictures and the plane was completely destroyed, so you imagine that was a pretty bad plane crash. So you're kind of filling in the gaps. You've probably seen footage of other plane crashes on TV before, so your sources get all scrambled up. You might very well have a very vivid memory of a plane crash in your head. It just doesn't happen to be that particular plane crash that I'm implying you should know about.
That's really interesting. So basically, just by asking the question without any explicit effort to let people believe anything, just leading them through the process, it's almost like hit a button and your brain is going to make up its own story.
Yeah. So close your eyes for a second. Close your eyes for a second.
Okay.
All right. Now you've been face to face with me for like half an hour now.
Okay. Just a disclaimer, anybody here, if Bianca is trying to manipulate me, let me know after this. We got visual evidence and everything. I'm not responsible for anything I do for the next 20 minutes.
Describe the color of the wall behind me.
I would say white.
Okay. What's the color of the glasses that I'm wearing?
You don't wear glasses?
Ah, you're good.
See, mathematics training, right?
Good. All right, I should have asked you like 3 minutes into this. But again, so right now I asked you what are the color of the glasses, what's the color of the glasses I'm wearing, and you very accurately said you're not wearing glasses right now, but maybe a week later, we see each other. Well, right now we won't be able to see each other on campus, but usually I wear glasses. So maybe a week later you see me wearing my usual dark glasses. And then 2 weeks later, I go, hey, remember when we had that chat over video? Was I wearing my glasses? And you might go, I'm pretty sure. Don't you usually wear your glasses? So again, it just kind of filters into it. Just the suggestion that maybe I was wearing glasses.
And maybe even if you have a picture of you wearing glasses on your profile, which I saw before, or maybe even there's another lady who also wears, who's similar age. Yep. Not even similar looking, it's just like, okay, I associate several keywords together and suddenly my brain tried to take all these distributed elements and put them together into a coherent memory.
Yeah.
And then the magic just happens. That actually brings us to a very interesting, and maybe some question I should ask at the first, that is what is memory exactly?
Oh,
Like, do we live in a simulation?
That is an hour-long conversation. So the short answer is that anytime you form a memory is basically anything that happens in your brain is basically just neurons firing, right? Any kind of cognitive process happening at any given time is just a bunch of different combinations of different neurons firing different parts of your brain. So the kind of simplified version of what is memory is basically as you're encoding a new memory, whatever that might be. That could be something you experience, something you know, learning to ride a bike, kind of these procedural skills that you're learning. It's really just neurons connecting in different ways. Neurons that were not connected before, now finding a connection to each other, being linked to each other. And so this happens at encoding, and the different neurons are connected. And then it kind of matters how deeply you've encoded it, right? Again, this is completely a simplified version of this, but if you just kind of vaguely encode something, we call that shallow processing, then your connections might not be the strongest. So the next time I have to reactivate that memory, it might not work as well. But if I encode something very deeply, very effortfully, those connections might be a lot stronger. There might be more connections all coming into each other with more input that's later able to reactivate that memory. So again, at the very basic level, memories is really just different neurons connecting, forming connections. And then later, as you activate the memory or retrieve the memory, kind of recreating that initial process that happened at encoding.
So it's almost like re-experience the same thing again with as much detail encoded as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. How do we decide how much detail we put into our memory? Just as you said, right? We have limited attentions. If I experience anything, I would just say pick a number. Like, do you remember 40 things about this conversation? Like, what's the color? What's the time of the day and everything? And we also don't actively memorize that, right? It's like, what's the time right now? Unless I really actively look for that. Yeah. So how much things do we memorize as we just experience?
That's a good question. So we distinguish between intentional learning and intentional encoding and incidental learning or incidental encoding. So a lot of the stuff that you remember, you may never have intentionally set out to remember. So I always, when I talk to my students in class about this, I always give this example of, give me a TV show that you really like to watch.
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones. Okay. My husband loves that show. I couldn't get into it. It's too gory. So let's say, so there are a ton of different characters, right, in that show. And I would have to imagine that if you're a really big fan of the show and you've seen all the seasons, that you could probably have a really long conversation about Game of Thrones and the different characters, right? Who's related to who, who's killed who slept with who, blah, blah, blah. Now, I would also imagine that at no point did you sit down as you were watching Game of Thrones with a notepad, taking notes about the character names and who's related and who's doing what. You just happened to remember it, right? It was incidental learning, incidental encoding. You didn't really put a lot of effort into it. You were interested. That's kind of a good starting point. You were invested. You had repeated exposure. That's also a good starting point. And that led to some kind of encoding over time. Now, if I then had to sit down and watch all, I don't know how many seasons, episodes there are now of Game of Thrones, without really enjoying it as much and just for the sake of learning it and studying it, then I would engage in more intentional learning, right? I would sit down and I would go, okay, I know about this character and this character, and I can have my Wikipedia open while I'm watching the show and kind of figure out who's doing what and who's related to whom. So again, how much effort we put into it, how likely the deep and the shallow encoding really depends on, I don't know, 50 different million factors of how invested are you? How many exposures have you had? What's the way in which you're encoding it? How much do you actually care? What's at stake? How important is it? And sometimes we don't really realize this until later on, right? So again, I talk to my students about this and I say, when I first exam that comes up in a class, they obviously want to know what's the format, right? Is it multiple choice? Is it short answer? And I ask them, why do you care? Obviously, that's a silly question. I know why they care. But when we talk about memory and encoding, they care because the way they're going to encode the memories of the material obviously will be very different if they know it's going to be a multiple choice test as opposed to a short answer test, right? The effort you put into it, into the learning and the understanding of the topic will likely be different, whether I just have to recognize it on a multiple choice versus, I really have to be able to talk about it and retrieve it from memory as I'm answering those short answer questions. So
that's interesting. But back to Game of Thrones examples. So like I enjoy the show, I memorize a lot. You don't enjoy the show, but you intentionally try to take notes and do everything. Which one actually is a bigger commitment? The intentional one or the incidental one?
Oddly enough, this is based on lab studies, there's not much difference between intentional and incidental learning.
But which one do you think will have a better outcome then for both of us? We can test it right now. I think I have a pretty decent memorization of everybody in that show, but I clearly didn't actively try to write down the notes. So I started to feel like, because I kind of feel like your way should be better, right? Because you actively invest. But then thinking about outcome, I kind of feel like, no, that's probably in general not the case.
No, actually the outcome, again, whether it's you or me, we would be a sample size of 2. That's hard to compare. But in a larger sample size, let's say we test this with 100 people. We get 50 people who are diehard Game of Thrones fans. And we get 50 people like me who are probably the only 50 people on earth who haven't seen the show. And we make these 50 people go through very effortful encoding of the show. In the end, the average outcome would probably be pretty similar.
Oh, okay.
It's, whether you have an intention or not, all things being equal, like if I do a really nice job of intentionally encoding and I really do some effortful processing, there's a pretty good chance the outcome, my memory of those different characters would not be all that different from someone who just incidentally encoded it while watching.
Interesting. As the thing become more and more complicated, you still cannot see a difference between these two groups? Because for now, it's still manageable.
Again, there could be lots of different other variables that kind of influence which group does better in the end. But
yeah, because we're teachers, I'm just thinking about learning here. Just like, hey, some people who enjoy the class would never take notes. And some people who came here and just, I am committed to a 4.0. I don't care, whatever the class is. And
yes,
I'm trying to compare these two and try to say, hey, who is going to get a better.
For any student listening right now, do not rely on incidental learning. Use effortful processing as you're encoding information.
Yeah, that's kind of like when I talk with other people, especially my students, like how I learn stuff. After talking to you, it seems like every time I instantly take something like a movie, after the movie ends, I always take another extra 5 or 10 minutes to just recap everything happening in the movie to tell a coherent, linear relationship between every single element. So that's kind of my hobby. But okay. I think that's part of the reason why I memorize so many interesting movie storylines, simply because I just do them again right after I watch the movie. But seems like these are two different processes as I watch the movie and also the recap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the watching is more the incidental piece, and then you recapping it is more of an intentional kind of, you're putting it into a structure, you're kind of reactivating the timeline, you're trying to actively, you might even be, so that's the other thing, memories aren't really existing in isolation, right? So any new memory that you're forming is then linked to other memories. And sometimes it's linked in a kind of logical way, like every birthday memory you have is likely linked to other birthday memories. But other times it might be linked to very weird things that you wouldn't expect them to be linked to, where your brain does its own kind of connections that rationally may not make sense to you, but make perfect sense to your brain as to why it's linking this memory to that memory right there. And it's different for everybody.
Yeah, that's why I want to ask, like, it varies person by person, right? What got linked together.
Yeah.
Wow. That's really interesting. Can you erase people's memory?
Say again?
Can you erase people's memory instead of changing it or planting it?
That's a tricky question. Theoretically, yes. Practically, it's questionable. Again, we know just enough about memory, and we know a ton about memory, but the reality is probably that we barely scratched the surface, as is the case with probably just about any other topic that we think we know stuff about. So if we just go by this idea of memories are really just neural connections, then yes, it should be possible to somehow isolate these neural connections and sever them. Whether I can do that very, very intentionally, I think that's probably somewhat, at least to my knowledge, beyond our current technology. I think there's a movie that kind of has that theme of, isn't there a movie? Erasing memories, like bad breakups, and you go in and you have those memories erased.
Maybe some episode of Black Mirror. I've seen something similar before.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So yeah, I mean, you can erase memories by just having a few too many drinks, right? We've all, I don't know if we've all had that, but that's a pretty common occurrence in some people more than in others. But yeah, you can erase memories by just kind of disrupting the encoding in the first place and not being able to kind of recreate some of those neural connections. If I deprive you of sleep for a long enough period of time, your memories are really going to suffer. There's a lot of evidence that, so you encode something in the first place and you're forming these memories, and then as you're sleeping, your brain kind of recreates those connections and replays them. And by doing that, it solidifies them and kind of sends them on, it's almost like your computer updating at night and kind of reformatting and making things flow a little more efficiently. That's what your brain does at night. It kind of updates the cortex to say, hey, here's what we learned throughout the day, update and have that available tomorrow. So if I deprive you of sleep for long enough and I don't let you do that update every night, then I can really mess with your memories and erase some of those. Again, it's hard to say, are they completely erased? Are they just gone? Did those neuronal connections disappear? Or are they just so weakened that I don't have the energy, like the brain energy, to recreate them and re-access them? So that's a tricky question to answer. Are they really gone or just inaccessible?
That's interesting because, people say once you learn something, you cannot unlearn it, right? That's kind of where my question comes from.
Yeah, so in some ways that's true. So we call that savings. So do you play an instrument?
Roughly. Very, very bad, but I claim I play. I play guitar and piano.
Okay, did you learn any of those when you were a kid?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so let's say you learned to play the piano when you were a kid. So did I. I had a few lessons. I hated the lessons. I loved playing the piano. I hated the lessons. So I quit. I was a total quitter. Compared to someone who hasn't learned the piano, so I might have a friend right now and their piano skills and my piano skills might be at exactly the same level. I don't really remember much. I'm a terrible piano player at this point. Again, you said you roughly play the piano, but chances are the traces of that learning playing the piano, the motor memory, some of the procedural skills are still kind of lingering in your brain. So if you now dedicated this entire stay-at-home pandemic to relearning the piano, chances are you would do much better than someone who didn't have that initial exposure as a child. Your current level might be pretty much the same, but those savings that you have in there kind of get reactivated as you're relearning it. So in some ways it's true, we can't unlearn it. We just unaccess it temporarily and then reconnect and use some of those savings later on.
That's interesting. You mentioned sleeping and the memory. So what's the relation between dream and the memory?
You're asking a lot of hard questions.
Just for fun.
just for fun. I have to tell you, I don't know that much about it. It's not necessarily a field that I've looked into a lot. All I know about sleeping in general is about kind of this solidifying of memories, and you definitely need sleep to solidify those memories. The field of dreams and kind of what dreams really are and why we have them is such a different kind of area of how the brain works. I just honestly don't know enough about it.
Yeah, it's kind of my hobby to ask every psychologist about dreams, because it seems like the study of dreams has been haunting for a while now. Just it has used to be popular, right?
It probably depends on who you ask, right? If you ask a Freudian person what do dreams tell you, they'll have a very different approach than if you ask a cognitive neuroscience person. But yeah, I'm really not sure how I would connect dreams and memory.
Interesting. I heard a theory like last year. It's just about like the people who has, how to say, photographical memory. They remember everything they have. And people say, wow, you guys are genius. But what they say is actually my brain is malfunctioning because I lost the ability to forget. Yeah. Instead of memorizing everything, I don't know how to clean my storage. So that's part of like where I read about, like, part of the process happens maybe in the dream. It's just that you pick, as you said, you select what to memorize. Basically, you're also selecting what to forget. Yeah.
Yeah, there's if you're interested in, there's a cool book it's an older book. It's called The Mind of a Mnemonist.
The mind of a
mnemonist. So mnemonics,
I see.
Kind of strategies we use to remember things. And so this is kind of a book. So I think Luria is the author. And in it, he talks about this person with incredibly, I'm always reluctant to call it photographic memory, because that in some ways is kind of a misrepresentation, but just what we typically think of as photographic memory. And in this person, this has stuck with me ever since I read this probably 25 years ago. He describes his memory, like you said, he can't forget anything. So if he wants to forget something, he has to write it on chalkboard. So this tells you that it's a little older. So he writes it on a chalkboard and then actively, manually erases it. And the active process of actually writing it down and erasing it in real life somehow also is that he's able to erase it from his memory. And that's how he kind of frees up space.
It's a made up story, right? Is it
real?
It's real.
It's real.
Wow.
So this was the way this person described the way his memory works. That it's just, everything's in there, and the only way to get it out is to physically write it down and erase it.
So he found a way to actively make, using effort to forget, and he actually found a physical way to do it.
Yeah. Now again, this is based on an old book and an old kind of description of one person, so I can't say that that's a generalizable way of doing it.
But I mean, even just for one person, nothing actually worked. It's just amazing how.
Yeah, it always kind of stuck with me, that I don't know, illustration of how that works.
So how is our memory stored in our brain? I mean, I know the typical understanding is just like the drawer, right? The case, fire case, and you just take a drawer. Hey, here's my memory for my birthday. Put it back. But turns out everything was distributed, like in a more distributed fashion, right? So how is memory stored? How much do we know about that?
There's the cat.
Oh, beautiful.
So again, at the basic level, it's stored in your neurons, right? Each neural connection, you can kind of think of that as a memory. Different types of memories are then stored in different parts of the brain. So anything that you can think of as, we call them explicit memories. So facts that you know, events that you remember, they're usually kind of stored in your hippocampus. Short-term memories, kind of working memory. Let's say you're solving a somewhat complicated math problem, and there's lots of different steps along the way, and you kind of have to hold the first part of the equation in your mind as you're approaching the second part. We call that working memory. Those things are kind of in your frontal lobe. So your frontal lobe is highly active as you're kind of planning and executing and holding things in current awareness. Procedural memory, kind of the motor skills, more of the implicit stuff, like how to ride a bike, how to play the piano, kind of the brushing your teeth at night, that kind of stuff that we do kind of without conscious thinking, You don't have to think, okay, now I have to unscrew the cap of the toothpaste and put the toothpaste on the toothbrush. It just happens kind of procedurally. That's less in the hippocampus, it's less of a explicit memory. It's more of a kind of movement memory. So you see that kind of in the, we call them basal ganglia, or maybe the cerebellum. There's different parts of the brain where those things get stored more. But again, at the end of the day, it's really just neurons connecting and firing and refiring as we're activating it.
So depending on which type of memory you have, it's stored at different place.
Yeah.
You mentioned procedure memory, which is really interesting because procedure memory is formed fresh. So you learn how to drive, you learn how to ride a bike. Mm-hmm. So that thing was not procedure memory at first, and then it became procedure memory. So how did that process happen?
So usually anything that we now think of as kind of this almost automatic process, this procedural memory, at some point, like you said, when we first learned it, it was much more effortful, right? So most of us learned how to ride a bike when we were a little kid. So if we think back to that, there was a lot of kind of trial and error and kind of getting your muscles to figure out how to adjust to keep your balance and things like that. So at the time, again, neurons connecting, neurons kind of firing in different combinations. But because a lot of that procedural memory is still motor based and motor skills based, particularly things like riding a bike or playing the piano, it's probably even at the time a little more activation in kind of those procedural memory parts and less in the hippocampus. That's more for explicit things. Now, I can ask you to think back to, do you actually remember learning to ride a bike when you were a kid? That would then activate your hippocampus, because that's an actual event that you go back to and you can say, oh, I kind of vaguely do, but for all we know, it's a false memory, right? Because you made it up as you went along. But again, the actual procedural part of it would still be in a different part of your brain and becomes more and more connected. So initially in the learning stage, it's a weaker connection between the different neurons. And then as you're repeating the action over and over again, that connection gets strengthened and then becomes more automatic and more procedural.
So it's almost like you push the fresh learning memory to the motor part, and then eventually that's become part of the motor itself.
Yeah, I think that's a decent way of thinking about it.
Can memory be passed to the next generation through genetics?
Ooh, now we're getting a little philosophical. There is, so now we're talking almost a little bit of epigenetics. There is some research to suggest that, yes, it's not necessarily the actual memory that gets passed along, but kind of the consequence of the memory, if you will. We see this a little bit, and I think you talked to Betty DeBoer a little while ago about trauma, and I wasn't able to watch her entire thing, but there's some research to suggest that traumatic events are kind of encoded in someone's DNA in one way or the other. And
really?
Can actually get passed on, and I'm simplifying this terribly, and I'm butchering this completely. But yes, there's some research to suggest that you can pass on, you wouldn't pass on the actual memory. The memory is in your brain. You can't pass on your brain, obviously, but the kind of the lingering effect of it, that can get passed on through generations later on. And they, again, don't have the memory of it, but they might still have different ways of reacting to stimuli based on kind of this passed on experience of trauma. So I think there's some discussion of this, some research of this. When we talk about Holocaust survivors who survived the Holocaust, were maybe in a concentration camp, get liberated, then go on to live what we consider fairly healthy, normal lives to the extent that that's possible. Obviously, they're carrying that trauma with them. And there's some research to suggest that some of those trauma experiences, which in some ways I guess we could think of as memories, then can get passed on through the generations, and that some of those later generations are more susceptible to new trauma or react to new trauma differently than they would have otherwise.
Wow, that's some fascinating study there.
Yeah, I'm simplifying this greatly. This is not my area of expertise, but there's some interesting research on this. That's.
Yeah, I don't know. I talked with a lot of people at your department already on consciousness and brain and everything. Just every time you go into anything with brain, it's amazing like how much we know, how much fascinating stories we heard and data we collect, and also how little we know about what's the theories behind all this.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite ways of thinking about it, and I shouldn't quote anything without knowing the source of that quote, but it's kind of the gist of the idea is, if our brain was simple enough that we could understand it, we would actually be too stupid to understand it. So it's kind of that paradox of, yeah, we've created lots of really good technology and approaches in research to study the brain, but we're limited by what we can do. It's kind of the circular reasoning.
Yeah, it's almost like the painter who is painting himself. Yeah,
how smart the brain is.
I mean, same argument here. Similar argument here is just like, do we live in a simulation? Well, if you're in the simulation, you can never know if you're in the simulation, because when you are about to know that you're in a simulation, they can pause the simulation, change what you know, and then just restart the simulation. Similar thing with brain. It's just like you are using your brain to think about how brain works.
Yeah,
it's almost like from the beginning. It's
I mean, we can go back to very, very simple perceptual processes, right? Again, I know you talked to Alex O'Brien about sensation and perception. So we look around and I see my kitchen and my living room right now, and I think this is what I'm actually seeing. When in reality, that might not actually be what's real and what's really there. I mean, I know there are, my wireless router is giving off signals that, if I had the right technology, I might be able to see them, but clearly I can't see them. That doesn't mean they're not there. So just thinking about that, just kind of, I can't think about it too much because then it starts to freak me out a little.
Yeah, it's amazing how much, our perception, how different our perception can be to the real world, and that our perception is the only thing we know. Plus, somehow, it seems like across different culture, different kind of education, we can still communicate those kind of perceptions. And seems like every different person kind of share quite a bit, which is, every time I think about it, the more I think about it, the more I just feel like it doesn't make sense at all. It's just like, I understand how you feel. Like, what do you even mean by that?
Yeah, no, I am fascinated by the brain in general. I mean, clearly I'm particularly fond of thinking about memory, but just the brain in general and all the different cognitive processes that we're just engaging in without even being aware of it as we're walking through our day.
With everything going on with the virtual reality, do you think that thing is going to, I don't know, just somehow change or enhance or damage our memory system? Or I don't know, I just, some random question here, but I just figured, like, if my memory is formed with a virtual experience, yeah, how does my brain to make sense of this?
Yeah, I mean, then you go back to, all of a sudden that difference in memory characteristics isn't as different anymore, right? Because the virtual reality that you're experiencing feels so much like the real world that it's becoming harder and harder to distinguish between the two. So then all of a sudden you would be even less able to kind of trust your own memories and your brain, because you can't really distinguish the virtual from the real. This kind of goes back to your question about dreams. I'm sure we've all had these situations where you have a very vivid dream about something, maybe people you know in real life, and maybe they do something that really pisses you off, and you wake up and it feels so real that you're actually mad at that person, and you see them in person and you just have this implicit idea of, I'm just really annoyed with you right now. And it's not until later that you realize they didn't do anything to me in real life. I had a dream about them annoying me, and that my brain didn't distinguish at that moment between encoding it in the dream or it happening in real life. And now I'm still mad at them in real life, even though they didn't really do anything.
To exercise that, you need really strong self-control and self-awareness.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually had this experiences with one of the people I know before. Just like sometimes actually, if you don't self-introspect too much, you basically just follow whatever you feel. So no matter it's dream or real, or if something even happened in the way you thought it happened, but somehow your behavior just changed fundamentally just because what you perceive.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so that brings you back to source memory, right? And we have to do that source monitoring of constantly thinking, do I just remember the thing, but also where's that thing coming from, right? That feeling that I have of being annoyed with my friend, what's the source of that feeling? Is the source an actual interaction I had with them, or is the source that weird dream that I had and I woke up from in the morning? And that's the source that we have to keep monitoring. And like you said, it requires some level of introspection and kind of active monitoring to really distinguish between the two.
So is that a mechanics we have for ourselves to make sure our own memory is reliable?
Yeah, so ideally we would do that, right? Ideally, we would always remind ourselves of how flawed our brain is. Realistically, we hardly ever do.
Yeah.
Realistically, again, our brain is inherently lazy and it loves the shortcuts. And 80%, 90% of the time it works using shortcuts and being inherently lazy. And those 10% of the time, and again, I'm making up those numbers completely, but the 10% of the time where it works against you, you don't always remind yourself or your brain that, hey, you have a tendency to overreact here. And you should really take a step back and think about the source and think about whether that's real or not. Do we do that on a regular basis? Probably not enough.
Interesting. Well, I think I learned a lot about memories. I want to close this podcast with one last question. That is, what's the next big thing about memory you are looking forward to know?
Wow. That's a good question. That stumped me. I think I'm always interested in, again, over the years, we've developed better technology about studying the brain in general and studying memory in general. I think at this point, it feels like we know a lot and we know pretty much everything there is to know. I know that that's not true. So I think I'm looking forward to just advances in technology and kind of technology allowing us to take a different look at things, that study things from a different perspective. We have MRIs, we have ways to scan the brain, but what's the next big thing? This idea of kind of more the Black Mirror kind of approaches of, can we upload our thoughts? Can we upload our memories to an external device and then transfer them to some other brain? Kind of that technology brain interface to me is kind of interesting, that futuristic.
Yeah. Are you following any work Neuralink is trying to do? It's Neuralink. It's a company Elon Musk opened, and what they were trying to do is they were trying to put chips in your brain. Somehow they use surgeries and try to make sure that, okay, at the beginning, just increase the storage, no memory, no CPU, no anything, but just the memory, a memory storage of your brain. So that's what they're trying to do. That's one thing to see. And there's another really interesting. Maybe you're already aware of this. Have you heard about the Brain Project in Europe?
No.
What they were trying to do is actually they were trying to make a copy of human's brain using fMRI.
Okay.
They just try to put everything in the computer and try to say, can we simulate the brain in a computer? Meanwhile, in the United States, what they were trying to do is they're trying to actually cut the brain piece by piece and scan everything to make a copy of a working brain, and then starting from there to start to do. But go back to what you said about memory. I think there's a reason I don't know where I heard about this. I think that was 2 years ago. People are actually already doing experiments with rats. So they take a rat who learn a certain kind of reflections. They see a light, probably they push a button or something like that. They try to take that part. I think it's a hippocampus. Okay, they take that part, and then they have a technology called optics, and basically they try to inject some kind of, they try to genetic engineer some kind of things into the neuron of that rat, right in the hippocampus, so they can actually activate that memory by shining a light on it and shut it off. But just close the light, and then I think they tried to transfer the memory of the rat who was trained to the rat who was not trained.
And how did that go?
It worked, but I don't remember the technology they used. That's the sad part. But they were trying to do that.
I'm going to look into that.
That's interesting because I found that thing right after I found another interesting research that is they try to use EEG to capture the waves in your brain, and they ask a researcher in Japan, I think, maybe Tokyo, to think about moving their right arm, and then they send the signal captured by their EEG all the way to San Francisco, and another scientist just raised their arm by receiving that signal. So you can almost start to manipulate other people's body, and it seems like it's really nice.
It is both frightening and fascinating to think about kind of that technology brain human interface. I think if I was a little more paranoid, I would be concerned about it, but I think I'm just mostly excited about different possibilities and what we can figure out in the future.
Neuroscience is just a fascinating field. Are you a part of the neuroscience program?
Very tangentially, in that I teach one of the optional courses in there. I'm by no means a neuroscientist, so I know just enough to be dangerous.
Yeah, but I can't wait to actually see that major to grow and try to see all the interesting stuff can come out of it. I was really amazed the first time I found actually we have a neuroscience major here.
Yeah, I think right now it's just a minor, but
a minor, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think students are really enjoying it and taking to it, and there's some I love that combination of philosophy and biology and psychology. It's a really good combination.
It's crazy, like it's probably the best minor you can hope for. You got people from philosophy and all the people coming together and just working on the same thing.
Obviously I'm biased, but I agree. It's pretty awesome.
Great. Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. And I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
Great.